Starting today, this kitchen is my ridge!
Welcome to the Cowboy Heartweaver. Today we share a story of healing and a love that truly sees the heart. Let us begin.
The early morning air at Ironwood Ranch was not merely cold. It was a jagged, invisible blade of frost that sliced through the structural gaps of the timber walls and settled with a heavy, aching persistence into the very marrow of the bone. In the bleak slate-grey light of the pre-dawn hour, the sprawling yard was a symphony of harsh, metallic survival. The sharp clatter of frozen bits and bridles, the rhythmic, hollow thump of heavy leather boots striking the iron-hard dirt, and the low, grumbling murmurs of men who lived their entire lives in the long, exhausting shadow of the frontier. Evelina stood alone in the centre of the cavernous kitchen, her broad, monumental forehead pressed against the freezing glass of the window. She watched through a small circle she had wiped clear of condensation as the breath of a dozen ranch hands plumed into the air like thick white funeral smoke. She could feel the heavy iron key ring, the cold, physical weight of her newfound sovereignty pressing firmly against her hip. It should have been her armour, but as the window caught a stray reflection of her own form in the guttering lamplight, a familiar, sickening shiver of insecurity uncoiled in her gut. In the distorted glass, her shoulders looked impossibly wide, her silhouette a massive, immovable mountain of wool and apron that felt entirely out of place in a world that idolized the fragile and the faint. The ghosts of Oakhaven, with their sharp tongues and narrow minds, seemed to dance in the reflection, mocking the very space she occupied. Suddenly, a raucous, jagged burst of laughter cut through the morning stillness, drifting up from a knot of men gathered near the pump house. "Mort met telling you, Silas," a voice sneered, thick with a cruel mocking amusement that travelled easily over the frozen ground. "The boss didn't bring home a wife. He went and bought himself a prize heifer to lead the herd. Did you see the sheer width of her when she was hoisting those 50-pound flour sacks yesterday? She's got more meat on her frame than the entire winter stock combined." Another man chuckled, a low, oily sound that made Evelina's skin crawl. Harlan Vance always did have a hunger for more land. Seems he decided he needed a woman built like a secondary barn to match the property. "Mort ask you, how's a man supposed to even approach a fortress like that without a ladder and a prayer?" The laughter that followed was sharp, venomous, and fueled by the kind of petty, cowardly malice that men use to feel tall when they are standing in the shadow of something they don't understand. Evelina's breath hitched, a soft, wounded sound that was swallowed by the roar of the stove. Her thick fingers curled so violently into the heavy canvas of her apron that the fabric groaned under the strain. The old suffocating shame, the slow-acting poison she thought she had buried in the mud of Oakhaven, flooded back into her lungs, turning the taste of her triumph into cold, bitter ash. Before we witness how the most underestimated woman in the territory prepares to answer those cruel whispers, not ve kepte hatta scream, but with the undeniable, unstoppable force of her capable hands, hit that like button and subscribe. The Queen of Ironwood is about to show this ranch what real strength looks like. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been judged for your appearance before you could show your heart? Let us see how Evelina takes back her throne. Evelina stepped back from the window, the heavy darkness of the kitchen closing in around her like a physical weight. The insults continued to burn in her ears, louder and more persistent than the crackle of the seasoned cedar logs in the massive black stove. Prize heifer, built like a barn. The words weren't new. They were the soundtrack of her 22 years, shouted across muddy streets and whispered behind gloved hands in every parlour she had ever been forced to scrub. But here, in the house where Harlan had given her the keys to his empire, the words felt like a violation of the very sanctuary she was trying to build with her own sweat. She looked down at her hands, illuminated by the flickering amber glow of the hearth. They were broad, powerful, and stained with the honest red of the morning cold. Her knuckles were scarred from years of labour, her palms callosed into a map of endurance. These were the hands that had scrubbed the ironwood floors until the wood gleamed like glass. These were the hands that had held a terrified, feral hound steady while she stitched its life back together. These were the hands that had kneaded the bread that had finally brought a look of peace to her husband's haunted, icy blue eyes. For one agonizing, terrifying minute, the urge to retreat was overwhelming. She wanted to bolt the heavy oak door of her bedchamber, crawl beneath the indigo quilts and shrink herself until she was invisible, until she no longer offended the world with her size. The gravity of her trauma was a powerful, seductive tide, whispering that she should apologize for the very air she breathed. But then, her gaze shifted to the massive black cast-iron stove. It sat in the corner of the room, a silent, monumental beast of utility and heat. It was heavy, it was broad, it was dark and formidable. It didn't care about the delicate proportions of a parlour stove, and it certainly didn't care about the cruel, shallow opinions of small-minded men huddling in the cold. It only cared about the intensity of the fire within its belly and its absolute ability to provide warmth and life to those who depended on it. Evelina squared her broad shoulders. A fierce, silent resolve hardening in the dark depths of her eyes. She didn't wipe away the single, hot tear that had escaped her lash. She let the radiant heat of the iron stove dry it against her cheek. The men of Ironwood were hungry, they were cold, they were exhausted, and they were survival-driven creatures who thrived purely on the energy she provided. If they wanted to see her as a beast of burden, she would show them exactly what a fortress was capable of producing. She wouldn't waste her breath arguing with their narrow minds. She would command their very survival through their stomachs. She would use the body they mocked, the very strength they feared, to create a feast so profound, so soul-stirring, and so vital that they would never dare to speak her name with anything less than absolute, shivering reverence again. She reached for the heavy iron handle of the water pump, her grip absolute and unyielding. Creak gush, creak gush. The sound was no longer a chore, it was a rhythmic war drum. She wasn't just preparing a breakfast. She was preparing a revolution of the heart, fueled by the very heart they claimed she didn't have. The kitchen was no longer merely a room. It had been transformed into a feverish cathedral of heat and silent, calculated defiance. As the heavy brass clock on the mantel ticked toward 5 a.m, Evelina moved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace that bordered on the mechanical. She had long since stripped away her restrictive wool bodice, standing now in a thin cotton chemise and a heavy canvas apron, her broad, powerful arms bared to the elbows and glistening with a fine sheen of perspiration. On the massive oak work table lay a mound of sourdough so immense it would have intimidated a seasoned commercial baker, but for Evelina the dough was a physical challenge she met with a fierce primal joy. She didn't just knead the dough, she dominated it. Utilizing the full monumental weight of her broad shoulders, she drove the heels of her hands into the floury mass, folding, stretching and pounding with a raw kinetic strength that made the heavy oak table groan on its thick legs. In the suffocating parlours of Oakhaven, they had mocked her for being too big, for taking up too aushehat air and space. But here, standing before 30 pounds of raw dough that needed to sustain 20 exhausted men, her size was a divine gift. A smaller, delicate woman would have been shattered by this task within minutes, her wrists buckling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but Evelina's pulse remained a steady, grounding thrum. Her muscles burned with a clean, satisfying fire. She was built for the heavy lifting of survival. She was the engine that would drive the very lifeblood of Ironwood. Thud. Fold. Thud. The sound of her labour was the only heartbeat in the otherwise silent house. Toby, the lanky, nervous chore boy, shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth hanging open in sheer unadulterated awe at the transformation of the space. The massive black stove was roaring now, its iron surface shimmering with a dangerous, vibrant heat. The air was thick, nearly opaque, with the intoxicating scent of proofing yeast, the savoury tang of rendered lard, and the sharp, clean smell of cedar smoke. "Ma'am," Toby whispered, his voice cracking with the uncertainty of a boy facing a hurricane. "The boss. He said Mott was to help you with the heavy work." Evelina didn't break her rhythmic assault on the dough. She turned her head slightly, her face flushed a deep, healthy crimson from the furnace like heat. her dark eyes flashing with a tactical intensity that made the boy instinctively take a half step back. It wasn't the look of a servant, it was the gaze of a general overseeing the fortification of a front line. "The lifting is done, Toby," she stated, her voice a low, resonant vibration that seemed to rattle the copper pots hanging from the ceiling. "Mort need you at the woodpile. This stove is a hungry beast, and Mort intend to keep it fed all day. Mort want a stack of seasoned oak and dry cedar 3 feet high by the back door, and then Mort want you to go to the deep root cellar and bring up every bushel of potatoes and onions we have in storage." "Every bushel, ma'am," Toby stammered, his eyes wide. "But the men, they usually just get a bit of salt pork and hardtack for the midday ration. They aren't used to." Evelina stopped. She straightened her back, her broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden, leaping flames of the hearth. She looked like a mountain of resolve that no storm could ever hope to move. "Starting today, the men of Ironwood will eat like they have a home worth defending," Evelina declared, her voice as ironclad and undeniable as the stove itself. "They think Mott am a beast of burden, fine. Mott will bear the burden of their hunger until they forget the very taste of a bitter, hollow meal. Now move, boy, the sun want to wait for your questions." Toby didn't hesitate for another second. He scrambled out the back door, the freezing prairie wind whistling briefly into the room before the heavy oak slammed shut with a definitive bang. Evelina turned back to her work. She began to divide the massive elastic dough into dozens of uniform balls, her thick, capable hands moving with a surgical precision that belied their size. She wasn't just making bread, she was crafting a physical rebuttal to every insult ever hurled her way. Each loaf would be a testament to her competence. Each savory meat pie would be a brick in the new wall of her reputation. She reached for a heavy iron cleaver and a massive slab of smoked beef. The rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the blade hitting the butcher block was her answer to the whispers in the yard. She didn't need to scream. She didn't need to plead for respect. The steel in her hand and the fire in her belly would speak for her in a language that even the crudest man would understand. The language of survival and soul-deep nourishment. By 7 o'clock, the pale, honey-hued sunlight of the morning had finally begun to crawl across the frozen yard, casting long skeletal shadows of the fences against the snow-dusted dirt. The ranch hands, men forged of grit, leather, and years of bone-deep exhaustion, were beginning to congregate near the kitchen's back porch. They moved with a sluggish, winter-induced lethargy, their collars turned up against the wind, but as they approached the main house, their pace faltered. A scent was wafting through the crisp, biting air, a scent so powerful, so complex, and so utterly unexpected that it seemed to arrest the very motion of the compound. It wasn't the usual thin aroma of scorched coffee and rancid salt pork. This was something else entirely. It was the scent of slow-simmered onions caramelizing in lard, the heady floral sweetness of honey-glazed apples, and the heavy yeasty promise of fresh bread rising in a furnace-hot oven. It was a smell that didn't just drift, it commanded. It was a smell that belonged in a high-priced hotel in St. Louis, or a grandmother-esque farmhouse in the lush valleys of the East, not here in the rugged, desolate heart of a frontier cattle ranch. Silas, the foreman, stood at the front of the group, his hat pulled low over his weathered, skeptical eyes. He inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring, a rare flicker of genuine confusion crossing his scarred features. Beside him, Miller and Jake, the two men whose cruel laughter had earlier punctured Evelina's peace, looked toward the kitchen door with a frantic, animalistic mixture of hunger and growing suspicion. "What in the hell is she doing in there?" Miller muttered, his stomach letting out a loud, traitorous growl that was audible even in the wind. "Sounds like she's rebuilding the damn foundation with a sledgehammer. But it smells like Christmas morning." Suddenly, the heavy back door swung open with a definitive, echoing thud. Evelina stepped onto the porch. She had donned her heavy wool bodice once more, but she hadn't bothered with a shawl. The sheer radiant heat of the kitchen was still radiating from her skin like an invisible aura, meeting the freezing morning air in a faint ethereal mist of steam. She looked absolutely monumental standing there, her broad shoulders silhouetted against the golden glow of the interior lamps, her thick hands resting comfortably on the heavy iron key ring at her hip. She didn't look like a woman seeking approval. She looked like a monarch overlooking her domain. "Breakfast is served," she announced. Her voice didn't waver, and it didn't possess a single note of the servile hesitation the men expected. It was a rich, resonant command that carried over the yard like a bell. "You will enter through the side mudroom. You will leave your boots, your spurs, and your filth on the rugs provided. If Mort finds so much as a single speck of frozen manure on my scrubbed pine floors, you will be eating your rations from a tin bucket in the stables for the remainder of the month. Am Mort understood?" The men blinked, stunned into a collective, awkward silence. In the 5 years since Harlan Vance had built this house, they had never been allowed past the kitchen-s threshold for a formal meal. They were used to taking their hardtack and muddy coffee in the cold shadows of the bunkhouse or balanced on the edge of a fence rail. Silas was the first to move. He climbed the porch steps, his sharp, evaluating eyes meeting Evelina's dark, unyielding gaze. He saw the flush of exertion on her cheeks, the fine dusting of flour on her strong forearms, and the absolute, terrifying pride in her posture. He tipped his hat, a gesture that was no longer just a habitual politeness, but a signal of genuine, hard-earned curiosity. "After you, boys," Silas grunted, his voice gruff. "Let's see if the lady's bite is as good as her bark." The men filed in, their boots thumping softly as they obeyed the command to strip away their outdoor gear. As they crossed the threshold into the kitchen, a profound, reverent silence fell over the group. The long oak table had been transformed into a fortress of nourishment. Stacks of golden, flaky sourdough biscuits, each the size of a man's fist, towered on heavy ceramic platters. Massive iron bowls of thick, creamy gravy, infused vacapite, hat black pepper, and chunks of savoury hand-crumbled sausage sat steaming in the centre. There were pans of fried potatoes, sliced thin and browned to a crisp in bacon fat, and a colossal ceramic crock of baked apples shimmering vacapite hat honey and wild nutmeg. At the centre of it all sat the coffee, not the weak grey sludge they were accustomed to, but a pitch-black fragrant brew that smelled of energy and hope. Evelina didn't take a seat. She stood by the massive black stove, her arms crossed over her chest, her monumental frame acting as a silent, watchful guardian of the hearth. She watched them with a steady, unreadable expression. Specifically, she watched Miller and Jake as they stared at the spread with wide, disbelieving eyes, their earlier insults seemingly choking them in the presence of such overwhelming abundance. "Sit," she said simply. They sat. For the first several minutes, the only sound in the room was the frantic clatter of forks against ceramic and the soft, involuntary groans of men who had forgotten what it felt like to be truly, deeply fed. They ate with a desperate, primal focus, their initial cynicism drowned in the sheer, staggering quality of the meal. Miller took a massive bite of a biscuit, his eyes closing in a brief, involuntary moment of ecstasy. He looked up, catching Evelina's gaze for a fleeting second. He opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps a joke to ease the tension, or perhaps an insult to hide his growing shame, but no words came. The cruelty of his earlier whispers felt suddenly, violently out of place in the face of this woman's quiet, formidable generosity. Evelina didn't smile. She didn't need to. She saw the way their shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. She saw the way the tension of the frontier left their tired faces. She had silenced their tongues with her talent, and she was only just beginning to show them the true weight of her heart. Harlan Vance entered the kitchen just as the frantic clatter of silverware began to settle into the rhythmic, heavy silence of satisfied men. He had been in the stables since 4 a.m, his hands numb despite his leather gloves, as he wrestled with a stubborn mare and checked the winter tack. The scent of the meal had reached him even there, drifting across the frozen compound like a siren's song, cutting through the pungent, familiar odours of dry hay, horse sweat, and manure. It was a scent that had pulled at something primal and long dormant in his chest, making his stride longer and more purposeful as he headed toward the main house. He paused in the mudroom, stripping away his frost-dusted canvas duster and hanging his Stetson on its designated peg. Even through the heavy timber door, the kitchen felt different. It breathed with a vibrant, humid life that it had lacked for half a decade. When he finally stepped into the room, the sudden wall of radiant heat from the massive black stove nearly stole the breath from his lungs. Harlan stopped dead in the doorway, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale morning light spilling through the side windows. His icy blue eyes, usually sharp and calculating, widened as they swept over the scene. He saw his men, hardened, cynical cowboys who usually grumbled over their tin plates in the dirt, sitting at his long oak table, their heads bowed over steaming ceramic bowls, eating with a reverence usually reserved for Sunday church. And then, his gaze locked onto Evelina. She was standing by the date Energia sink, a heavy enamelled percolator in her hand as she refilled a mug. Her face was flushed a deep, healthy roar from the furnace like heat of the stove, and a few stray, dark tendrils of hair had escaped her neat knot clinging to her damp temples. She looked monumental, her broad shoulders squared, her presence filling the room in a way that made the cavernous kitchen feel almost small. She didn't look like a woman who had been bullied into service. She looked like the very heart of the machine, the fire that kept the entire clockwork of the ranch turning. Harlan walked to the head of the table, his boots making a heavy, deliberate sound against the scrubbed pine floor. The men instinctively straightened their backs, a few of them surreptitiously wiping their mouths with their sleeves, looking at their boss with a mixture of guilt and newfound pride. "Mott take it the kitchen is under new management?" Harlan asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate the very air in the room. Silas, sitting to Harlan's right, looked up from a half-eaten biscuit, a faint, rare smile, one that didn't reach his eyes but softened the harsh lines of his face, tugged at his lips. "Mort say it's under a dictatorship, boss," the foreman grunted, his voice thick with uncharacteristic satisfaction. "But Mott ain't heard a single man complain. Mott haven't seen this crew move this fast to get to a table since the war ended. I reckon if she told us to ride into a blizzard for another one of those apples, half the boys would be saddled up before she finished the sentence." Harlan sat down in his heavy oak chair. Evelina moved toward him, her movements fluid and unhurried. She set a plate before him, the ceramic clinking softly against the wood. It was a replica of the mountain of food she had served the men, but she had added a small white porcelain pot of the dark wild berry preserves she had found tucked away in the back of the root cellar. "Eat, Harlan," she said softly. Her voice was steady, but there was a new, vibrating energy in her tone, a quiet triumph that sang beneath her words. "You have a long day on the South Ridge, and the frost isn't going to melt itself." As Harlan took his first bite of the sourdough biscuit, the flavour, rich, buttery and perfectly tang, exploded across his palate. He looked up at her, his gaze intense and searching. He saw the flour on her forearms, the soot on her apron, and the absolute unyielding dignity in her dark eyes. He realized then that the monster of Ironwood and his fortress wife were no longer just two strangers sharing a roof under a contract of gold. They were becoming the architects of a new, formidable order. One by one, the men finished their meals and stood up. They didn't just trudge out as they usually did, avoiding eye contact. They paused. They lingered. Jake, the man who had earlier compared her to a prize heifer and a barn, stopped near the end of the table. He twisted his battered hat in his thick, scarred hands, his face turning a mottled, embarrassed red that clashed with his sun-beaten skin. He looked at the floor, then at the empty plate, and finally for a fleeting, painful second at Evelina. "Ma'am," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. That was the best damn meal Mort had in 5 years. Better than my mother S. And she was a saint in the kitchen. Thank you. He hurried out of the room before she could offer a reply. his spurs jingling with a frantic, nervous energy. Evelina watched the back door swing shut, the cold air rushing in for a brief moment before the latch clicked. The sting of the morning's insults was still there, a dull, bruised ache in the back of her mind, but it was being rapidly covered by a thick, protective layer of hard-earned victory. She wasn't just a space-taker anymore, she was a provider. She turned back to the kitchen, her eyes landing on the mountain of dirty ceramic plates and the heavy, grease-coated iron pans. The heavy lifting of the day had only just begun, but as she reached for the stiff scrubbing brush and the lye soap, her broad shoulders felt lighter than they ever had in the dusty, judgmental streets of Oakhaven. She was proving her worth, one biscuit and one act of labor at a time, and the ranch was beginning to listen. The kitchen fell into a profound, ringing silence the moment the last ranch hand disappeared across the frost-heaved yard. It was a thick, humid quiet, heavy with the lingering aromas of the morning's feast. The ghost of cinnamon, the savory ghost of rendered lard, and the sharp, acidic bite of dark coffee. The air in the room was still vibrantly hot, a stark contrast to the predatory chill scratching at the exterior timber walls. Evelina stood at the head of the long oak table, her monumental silhouette cast in long flickering shadows by the dying embers of the hearth. She looked at Morph, the wreckage of the meal. The heavy ceramic plates were scraped clean, the iron skillets were bone dry, and the massive Dutch oven was empty of every last crumb of sourdough. In Oakhaven, a table of empty plates had always meant more work for no thanks, a demand for her to vanish back into the scullery like a ghost. But here, looking at the empty vessels that had once held her labour, she felt a strange, surging electricity in her veins. Those empty plates were her first casualties in the war against their prejudice. Harlan remained in his chair for a long moment, his large, calloused hands resting flat on the scarred wood of the table. He didn't rush to leave. He watched her with a quiet, penetrating intensity that made the skin on the back of Evelina's neck prickle. He didn't offer a hollow thank you or a performative tip of the hat. He looked at her the way a general looks at a fortified position he didn't realize he possessed. "You didn't just feed them, Evelina," Harlan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to anchor the room. "You stunned them. Half those men have spent their lives eating dust and resentment. You gave them something they didn't know how to ask for." Evelina turned to him, wiping her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She didn't shrink under his gaze. She squared her broad shoulders, her dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the stove. "A man who works like a beast of burden will eventually start to think like one, Harlan," she replied, her voice a rich, resonant alto. "If you want them to hold this ridge against the winter, they need to feel like they are part of something that isn't just dirt and labor. They need to be fed from the heart, not just the larder." Harlan stood up, his massive frame nearly reaching the low-hanging copper pots. He took a step toward her, closing the distance until the sharp, clean scent of the freezing prairie air clinging to his wool shirt mingled with the warm, yeasty scent of her skin. He reached out, his leather-gloved hand pausing for a fraction of a second before he gently squeezed her shoulder. It wasn't a delicate touch, it was a firm grounding pressure, a recognition of her strength. "The ridge is long, and the winter is coming," Harlan said, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. "Command the kitchen as you see fit. If you need more stores, you tell Silas. If a man disrespects your threshold again, you tell me. Mot Luglung be back at sunset." With a final, lingering look that spoke of a burgeoning, unspoken respect, he turned and strode out the back door. The click of the iron latch felt like the closing of a chapter. Evelina didn't rest. The long war had only just begun. She turned her attention to the Dayton-O'Shea sink where Toby was already standing, looking overwhelmed by the mountain of greasy ceramic and heavy iron. The boy looked exhausted. His thin shoulders slumped. "Move aside, Toby," Evelina commanded, not with cruelty but with a firm maternal authority. The iron needs a woman's weight behind the brush. You go to the smokehouse and want 2 more slabs bacon brought up and a sack of the dried pinto beans. We're going to start the midday stew now, and Toby... The boy paused at the door, looking back. Tell Silas Mort want the large iron cauldron from the barn brought to the porch. We're going to need more than just 1 pot if we're going to do this right. As the boy scurried away, Evelina plunged her thick, capable hands into the scalding, lye-infused water. The heat bit into her skin, but she welcomed it. She grabbed a stiff scrubbing brush and attacked a cast-iron skillet with a rhythmic, powerful motion. Scrub, rinse, repeat. She was just cleaning. She was preparing ACT Mort had been a surprise attack, a sudden burst of flavour and heat that had caught the ranch hands off guard. But she carnivee kept that a single breakfast wouldn't erase years of ingrained cruelty. They would go out into the cold, their bellies full, but their minds would return to their petty jokes the moment the warmth faded. To win Ironwood, she would have to be consistent. She would have to be as unyielding as the prairie itself. She began to mentally catalogue the stores, the flour, the lard, the salted beef, the dried fruits. She would Renault this kitchen into a fortress of such undeniable comfort that no man would dare to whisper a word against the woman built like a barn ever again, because they would realize that without that barn, they would starve in the dark. By the time the mid-morning sun was high enough to glint off the frost on the yard, the kitchen was humming again. A massive pot of beans was simmering with salt pork and wild onions, the scent beginning to rise and fill the rafters. Evelina stood at the centre of the room, her apron stained, her hair slightly dishevelled, her broad frame radiating an aura of absolute unshakable purpose. She was no longer the girl who hid in the shadows of Oakhaven. She was the mistress of Ironwood, and she was preparing the next move in a game the men did even realise she was playing. The mid-morning sun had climbed high enough to cast sharp diagonal bars of brilliant dust-moted light across the scrubbed pine floors of the kitchen. It was a deceptive brightness, offering a visual warmth that the freezing prairie outside refused to honour. But within the thick timber walls of the Ironwood main house, the air was a living, breathing entity of humid heat and complex, evolving aromas. Evelina stood at the massive oak worktable, her silhouette momentarily engulfed in a column of sunlight. She had not sat down since 4 a.m, her sturdy legs bearing her monumental weight for kept had a tireless, rooted grace. The exhaustion that usually plagued her after a morning of labour in Oakhaven, a heavy, soul-crushing fatigue born of resentment and fear, was nowhere to be found. In its place was a sharp, vibrating clarity. She felt every inch of her broad frame as a well-oiled machine perfectly engineered for the task at hand. On the back of the stove, the massive iron cauldron Silas had delivered now sat bubbling with a low rhythmic thrum. Inside, 20 pounds of dried pinto beans were slowly surrendering their hardness to the scalding water, mingling with thick hand-carved slabs of salt pork and a mountain of wild onions that Evelina had spent an hour dicing. The scent was deep and earthy, a foundational smell that promised hours of steady, slow-burning energy for the men working the frozen ridges. Evelina reached for a heavy burlap sack of cornmeal. She didn't measure with the delicate precision of a pastry chef. She measured with the intuitive, ancestral knowledge of a woman who understood the variables of heat, moisture, and hunger. She poured the golden meal into a colossal ceramic bowl, her thick fingers sifting through the grains, checking for the slight grit texture that promised a perfect crust. "Ma'am?" The voice was gruff, hesitant, and preceded by a polite but heavy knock on the mudroom doorframe. It was Silas. The foreman stood there, his hat in his hand, his eyes scanning the transformed kitchen with an expression that sat somewhere between awe and defensive suspicion. He looked at the bubbling cauldron, then at the stack of fresh cedar wood Toby had piled by the door, and finally at Evelina's broad, flour-streaked face. The boss said Mort was to check in, to see if you needed the wagon sent to town for more flour, or whatever else you were planning on burning through, Silas said, his voice dropping into a cautious drawl. He stepped into the room, the smell of the bean stew hitting him like a physical blow to the stomach. "Not seen this crew eat, Mrs. Vance. They like locusts in a wheat field. Usually we just give 'em a sack of hardtack and a prayer and let 'em figure it out." Evelina didn't stop her work. She began to whisk rendered lard into the cornmeal, her strong arm moving in a powerful, mesmerizing circle. "A prayer does mend a fence line in a frost, Silas," she replied, her voice rich and resonant, filling the cavernous space. "And hardtack does to keep a man's blood from thickening in his veins. If you want them to give Harlan their best labor, you have to give them a reason to believe the day is worth surviving." She stopped her whisking and looked directly at the foreman. She didn't look up to him. She stood nearly eye to eye with the man, her presence every bit as formidable as his own scarred, weathered history. "Mort have enough flour for the week, but Mort Luglunk need more lard and a side of cured ham by Friday," Evelina stated, her tone shifting into a calm executive authority. "And Mort want a dozen of the laying hens moved to the smaller coop near the kitchen. Mort met not walking a quarter-mile in a blizzard for eggs." Silas blinked. He was a man used to giving orders, a man who commanded a dozen hardened killers and outcasts with a single look. But as he stood in the radiating heat of Evelina's kitchen, he felt the undeniable shift in the rancher's gravity. The fortress wife wasn't just managing a larder, she was mapping out a campaign. "The hens, ma'am. The boys usually handle the coop." "The boys handle the cattle," Evelina interrupted gently but firmly. "The kitchen is my ridge. Expect my supply lines to be short and secured. Is that a problem for you, Mr. Silas?" A slow, deeply buried spark of respect flickered in the foreman's sharp eyes. He looked at the massive, capable woman before him, the woman the men had mocked as a prize heifer, and saw a leader who understood the brutal logistics of the frontier better than any merchant in Oakhaven. "No problem at all, Mrs. Vance," Silas grunted. He stepped back toward the door, replacing his hat with a deliberate, slow motion. "Mort Luglunk have the coop moved by sunset, and Mort Luglunk see to the ham myself. Anything else?" "Tell the men to be here at noon sharp," Evelina added, her attention already returning to the cornmeal. "The stew won't wait for a slow horse." As Silas disappeared back into the cold yard, Evelina felt a surge of quiet internal triumph. She wasn't just fighting the men's insults anymore. She was winning over the one man whose respect would stabilize her entire position at Ironwood. She reached for the heavy iron skillet, greasing it with a thick layer of lard. She began to pour the golden cornbread batter into the pan. As it hit the hot iron, it let out a sharp, satisfying sizzle, a sound of transformation. She wasn't just cooking, she was forging an empire of the hearth, one brick of bread and one bowl of stew at a time. Her broad shoulders, once a source of shame, felt like the very pillars holding up the roof of the house. She was the anchor, and today, for the first time, she knew it. The high noon sun hung like a cold, pale coin in the vast slate-grey sky, offering a blinding glare but no solace from the biting wind that whipped across the open valley. Outside, the world was a harsh, monochromatic expanse of brown dirt and white frost. But inside the Ironwood kitchen, the atmosphere had reached a state of humid, golden perfection. Evelina pulled the massive cast-iron skillets of cornbread from the oven. The crusts were a deep, burnished gold, crackling softly as the cooler air hit them, releasing a scent that was sweet, nutty, and overwhelmingly comforting. She set them on the cooling racks with a firm, rhythmic clack, her movements precise despite the hours of standing. Beside them, the great cauldron of pinto beans continued its steady, thick bubbling, a dark, savoury stew that had absorbed the essence of the hickory-smoked salt pork and the sharp, wild onions until it had become something more than just food. It was liquid endurance. The back door creaked open, admitting a violent swirl of snowflakes and the heavy, rhythmic thumping of boots. The men entered differently this time. In the morning, they had been driven by a frantic, disbelieving hunger. Now, as they filed into the mudroom, there was a palpable sense of anticipation and a newfound awkward obedience. They didn't just trudge in with their filth. They stood in the small cramped space, meticulously knocking the frozen mud from their heels and hanging their heavy coats with a quiet, sombre order that Silas had clearly reinforced. As they stepped into the main kitchen, The wall of heat and the concentrated aroma of the cornbread hit them with the force of a physical embrace. Evelina stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on the back of Harlan's empty chair. Her apron was stained with the day's labour, and a faint smudge of soot marked the high curve of her cheekbone, but she stood with the immovable dignity of a mountain. "Wash up," she commanded, her voice a resonant alto that cut through the low murmurs. She gestured toward the Datino-Zay basin she had filled with steaming, lavender-scented water, a small luxury she had insisted upon. "The dirt of the yard has no place at this table." The men obeyed in a stunned, silent line. Miller, the man who had earlier made the cruelest jokes about her size, was the last to wash. He kept his head down, his ears still burning a dull red, his thick, scarred hands scrubbing with a frantic, uncharacteristic thoroughness. When he finally took his seat, he didn't look at his companions. He looked at the empty space in front of him waiting. Evelina began to serve. She moved around the table with a fluid, powerful grace, her broad shoulders steady as she ladled thick, steaming portions of the bean stew into heavy ceramic bowls. She followed with massive, jagged wedges of the hot cornbread, the steam rising from the yellow crumb in fragrant plumes. The first few minutes were defined by a profound, ringing silence, the kind of silence that occurs when men are confronted with a kindness they don't know how to earn. Then the sound of spoons hitting ceramic began. It was the frantic, animalistic eating of the morning. It was slower, more deliberate. They were tasting the time she had spent over the stove. They were tasting the fact that someone had considered their exhaustion before they even felt it. "God Almighty," Jake whispered, his voice cracking as he broke off a piece of the cornbread, the steam hitting his face. This is thick enough to stand a spoon in. And the onions. They sweet as sugar." Miller took a cautious bite, his jaw working slowly. He didn't offer a joke, he didn't nudge his neighbour. He simply closed his eyes for a moment, the warmth of the stew beginning to thaw the deep, bone-weary chill he had carried since dawn. The mockery that had felt so clever in the shadows of the pump house now felt like a leaden weight in his gut. He looked at the woman standing by the stove, her monumental frame, her capable hands, and for the first time he didn't see a prize heifer. He saw the only person on this 5,000-acre ranch who seemed to care if he froze to death in the dirt. Evelina watched them from her post. She saw the way their frames, once tense and defensive, began to soften against the chairs. She saw the way the grumbled complaints about the cold vanished, replaced by a quiet communal peace. She realized then that her fortress wasn't just the walls of the house. It was the atmosphere she created within them. By feeding them from her heart, she was dismantling their prejudice piece by piece. "There is more in the pot for those who finish," she stated calmly, her voice anchoring the room. "And not expect the bowls to be returned to the sink, not left for the boy to hunt down." As the men nodded in silent agreement, their mouths full of the golden bread, Evelina felt a surge of quiet, internal power. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't wept. She had simply existed with such undeniable competence that their cruelty had no room to breathe. The silent war by the hearth was being won, not with steel, but with the steady, nourishing heat of a woman who finally knew her own worth. As the violet shadows of the late afternoon began to stretch across the valley floor, merging into a single bruised expanse of twilight, Harlan Vance rode back into the main compound. The cold was different now. It was a brittle, predatory thing that seemed to wait for the sun to drop completely before it truly bared its teeth. His massive black gelding was lathered and weary, its breath coming in thick, rhythmic plumes of white vapour. Harlan himself felt the weight of the day in his shoulders, a bone-deep chill that even his heavy duster couldn't quite repel. He expected the usual evening atmosphere, the bunkhouse door slamming as men retreated into their own exhausted silence. The sharp, defensive barks of the hounds, and the general air of a fortress holding its breath against the night. Instead, as he dismounted near the stables, he witnessed a subtle, almost tectonic shift in the gravity of his ranch. A group of hands was just leaving the kitchen porch, their silhouettes dark against the golden light spilling from the windows. Miller and Jake were among them. In the past, these men would have trudged away with their heads down, grumbling about the salt in their meat or the thinness of the coffee. But today they walked with a different stride, a heavy, contented pace of men whose bellies were full of something more than just calories. Miller stopped at the bottom of the steps, holding his heavy ceramic bowl with a strange, clumsy care. He turned back toward the door. "Good night to you, Mrs. Vance," he called out, his voice rough but devoid of the jagged mockery Harlan had grown accustomed to hearing in the yard. The door opened briefly, casting a wide, monumental shadow of Evelina onto the frozen dirt. "See that you don't lose that bowl." "Miller," her voice resonated, steady and commanding. "And tell Silas Mort want the wood box topped off before the frost sets in." "Yes, ma'am," Miller replied, and to Harlan's utter astonishment, the man actually touched the brim of his hat before turning away. Harlan stood perfectly still in the shadows of the stable awning, his hand resting on his horse neck. He had commanded these men for years with steel and gold, earning their fear and a hard-won professional respect. But in less than 48 hours, the woman with the broad shoulders and the quiet, fierce resolve had managed to extract a level of domestic obedience that Harlan hadn't even known was possible on a frontier ranch. She wasn't just feeding them, she was civilizing them. He led his horse into the stable, stripped the tack with practiced, mechanical movements, and headed toward the main house. The scent reached him 50 yards out, the deep, earthy aroma of the pinto beans and the lingering, sweet crust of the cornbread. It was a scent that didn't just suggest comfort, it demanded it. When he pushed through the back door, the heat of the kitchen hit him like a physical blow, a sudden and profound embrace that made his frozen joints ache with the sudden thaw. Evelina was standing at the sink, her back to him. Her broad shoulders were squared, her arms moving in a powerful rhythmic motion as she scrubbed a heavy iron cauldron. The lamplight caught the dark, rich texture of her hair and the damp sheen on her neck. She looked like a pillar of the house, a foundation stone that had always been there, waiting for the rest of the structure to be built around her. The men seemed to have found their manners. "Mrs. Vance," Harlan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the hiss of the steam. Evelina didn't jump. She finished rinsing the pot, set it on the drying rack with a deliberate clack, and turned slowly. Her face was flushed, her dark eyes bright with a mixture of exhaustion and a new vibrating pride. She wiped her hands on her apron, the heavy iron key ring at Mott of her waist jingling with the movement. "Manners are a luxury of the well-fed, Harlan," she replied, her voice steady and resonant. "A man with an empty stomach has no room for respect. Mort simply provided the space for them to remember they were men, not just labor." Harlan took off his leather gloves, his icy blue eyes locking onto hers. He saw the smudge of soot on her cheek and the sheer, magnificent substance of her presence. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of something he couldn't quite name, a mixture of awe and a fierce, possessive gratitude. "Silas told me you moved the coop," Harlan noted, a ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. He said he'd never seen a woman command a ham with such authority. "Silas understands the logistics of a winter," Evelina said, her chin lifting slightly. "Mottam not here to play at being a lady in a parlour, Harlan. Morn here to ensure this ranch survives. And survival starts at the hearth." Harlan took a step toward her, the smell of the freezing prairie on his coat mingling with the warm, savoury scent of the room. He didn't offer a flowery compliment. He reached out, his thick, calloused thumb gently brushing the soot from her cheekbone. The contact was brief, but it sent a jolt of raw electric heat through the air between them. "You are doing more than ensuring survival, Evelina," he said softly, his voice dropping an octave. You are giving this place a soul. I don't think Miller has said thank you to another living soul in a decade. You had him tipping his hat to a bowl of beans. Evelina's breath hitched, her dark eyes searching his. For a moment, the monumental fortress wife and the monster of Ironwood stood in the radiating heat of the stove, the silence between them thick with a burgeoning, profound understanding. She wasn't just a contract to him anymore. She was the heartbeat of the empire he had built. "Sit," she said, her voice regaining its authoritative edge to hide the sudden flutter in her chest. "The stew is still hot, and you look like you've been riding through the gates of hell." As Harlan took his seat at the head of the table, he realized that the silent war was indeed being won. But the greatest victory wasn't over the ranch hands, it was over the cold, empty silence that had occupied his own heart for far too long. The kitchen settled into that profound, heavy stillness that only comes when the rest of the world has surrendered to the dark. The only sounds remaining were the low, rhythmic hum of the massive black stove and the occasional, sharp tink of the cooling iron. Harlan had finished his meal, his movements slow and deliberate, savouring the last of the dark ale broth as if it were a rare vintage. He sat back in the heavy oak chair, his large frame relaxed, watching Evelina move through the ritual of the evening cleanup. She didn't let Toby stay for the late-night scrubbing. She had sent the boy to bed an hour ago. Noticing the way his eyes were drooping now, she stood at the zinc sink, her broad back to her husband, her arms submerged in the scalding, lye-thickened water. The steam rose in pale, swirling ghosts around her, dampening the stray tendrils of hair at her neck. Every muscle in her formidable frame ached with a deep, honest fatigue, but it was a heat she carried with pride. She reached for the sourdough crock, the living heart of her kitchen. With a rhythmic, powerful motion, she began to feed the starter, adding fresh flour and tepid water, her thick fingers stirring the viscous mixture with a strength that made the heavy ceramic jar vibrate against the counter. "You haven't sat down since the sun was a sliver on the horizon." "Evelina," Harlan said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to wrap around her in the quiet room. "The men are fed. The house is warm. Even a fortress needs to rest its gates." Evelina didn't stop her stirring. She felt the weight of the iron keys at her waist, a solid metallic reminder of her purpose. "The bread doesn't know the time, Harlan," she replied, her voice resonant in the humid air. "If Mort don't feed the starter tonight, there will be no biscuits for the men at 4. And if there are no biscuits, the morale you saw in the yard today will evaporate faster than the frost on a hot griddle." She turned slightly, wiping her hands on her apron, her dark eyes meeting his icy blue gaze. "They mocked me this morning. Harlan, Mott heard them near the pump house. They called me a prize heifer. They joked about needing a ladder to bed a fortress like me." The air in the kitchen suddenly turned cold, as if the prairie wind had found a way through the thick timber. Harlan's posture shifted instantly. The relaxed, satiated man vanished, replaced by a sudden, predatory stillness. His jaw tightened, the muscle leaping under the scarred skin of his cheek. "Which ones?" Harlan asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, razor-thin whisper. "Tell me their names, and they'll be off this land before the moon sets." Evelina felt a sudden, sharp surge of warmth in her chest, not from the stove, but from the raw, protective ferocity in his tone. In Oakhaven, no one had ever offered to defend her honor. They had been the ones leading the laughter. But she shook her head, a small, triumphant smile touching the corners of her mouth. "No," she said firmly. "Mort don't want them gone. If you run them off, they look just carry their stories to the next saloon. And Mort look still be the heavy girl they escaped. Mort vey keppen a tay them here. Mort vey keppen a tay them to eat my bread every morning." Mutvei kepna te them to feel the heat of my stove every noon. Mutvei kepna te them to realize that the fortress they mocked is the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave in the snow. She walked toward the table, her boots making a solid, grounding sound on the pine boards. She stood before him, her monumental presence matching his own. Mort found your letter. Harlan, she whispered. The words heavy with the memory of the parchment she still carried in her pocket. The one to the innkeeper. The one where you asked for a foundation stone, a woman who takes up space. Harlan didn't look away. He did offer a shallow apology for the bluntness of his request. He slowly stood up, his massive frame towering over her. Yet for the first time, Evelina didn't feel the need to shrink. Mort meant every word, Evelina, Harlan murmured, his voice thick with a profound, terrifying sincerity. The men in that yard, they are small. They judge the world by what they can break or carry. They see your size and they fear it because they don't have the substance to match it. But Mort see you. Mort see the way you command this hearth. Mort see the way you turned a pack of wolves into men today, with nothing but your skill and your will. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers hovering near her hand before he gently rested them on the wooden tabletop, inches from hers. You are not a prize heifer, Evelina. You are the mistress of Ironwood. And if you intend to win this war with biscuits and stew, then Mort will stand guard at your back while you do it. Evelina looked down at his hand, a hand that had built an empire, and then up at his face. The monster and the fortress stood in the dying light of the kitchen. Two souls built on a scale the rest of the world could to comprehend. The wind is shifting, Harlan, Evelina said, her voice regaining its steady, executive edge. The smell of the air is changing. There's a heavy frost coming, maybe more. Mort met going to double the rations for tomorrow. If a storm hits, Mort want the smokehouse moved closer to the kitchen porch tonight. Harlan nodded, the professional respect in his eyes shining brighter than any romantic sentiment. Mort le glunk have Silas move the sled of salt pork before he turns in. Rest when you can. Mrs. Vance. The territory is about to get a lot colder. As he walked out toward the foyer, his spurs jingling softly, Evelina turned back to her sourdough. She plunged her hands into the dough, the weight and resistance of it, a comfort she couldn't explain. She was no longer just a woman who took up space. She was the woman who filled it, verkepte hat purpose. And as the first flakes of a coming storm began to scratch at the window pane, she knew that her real test was only just beginning. The silence of the Ironwood main house during the witching hour was never truly absolute. It was a living, breathing quiet, punctuated by the rhythmic, settling groans of massive timber beams and the distant, mournful whistle of the wind as it whipped through the jagged coulees of the valley. But tonight, the atmosphere within the kitchen had shifted. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange electric tension that made the hair on Evelina's forearms stand on end. The smell of the coming storm was unmistakable now, a sharp metallic scent of ozone and frozen earth that seemed to seep through the very pores of the wood. Evelina moved through the shadowed kitchen like a phantom of industry. She had not sought the sanctuary of the massive four-poster bed upstairs. Instead, she had claimed the space beside the hearth as her command post. She didn't use a candle. The pulsing cherry-red glow from the stove belly provided enough light for a woman who knew her terrain by touch and instinct. She moved to the back porch, her boots silent on the rugs she had laid down. Outside, the world had been swallowed by a thick, suffocating darkness. There were no stars tonight, only a vast, obsidian void. She reached for the heavy iron latch of the wood box she had commanded Toby to fill. The wood was cold, the bark rough and biting against her palms, but she hoisted the massive oak logs into her arms with a grunt of primal satisfaction. In Oakhaven, carrying such a load would have been a punishment, a way to break her spirit. Here, it was a tactical necessity. Each log was a unit of heat, a guarantee that her fortress would not fall to the encroaching frost. She returned to the stove, fed the fire until it roared with renewed appetite, and then turned her attention to the massive prep table. She was not just preparing for breakfast, she was fortifying the ranch for a siege. If the storm hit as the air promised, the men would be able to reach the kitchen easily. She began to pack storm rations, heavy, dense biscuits split and stuffed with thick slabs of fried salt pork wrapped in clean linen cloths. She moved with a tireless, monumental grace, her broad shoulders working in a steady rhythm as she sliced, fried and packed. Her mind was a whirlwind of logistics. How many men in the bunkhouse? How much coffee in the canister? If the snow drifts over the mudroom door, where is the shovel? As she worked, she felt the sheer undeniable presence of her own body. For 22 years, she had been taught to hate the volume she occupied. She had been told her strength was unnatural for a woman, her endurance a sign of a base common nature. But as she hoisted a 40-pound cauldron of water to the stovetop without breaking a sweat, the lies of Oakhaven finally withered and died. Her size wasn't a burden, it was a reservoir. Her broad shoulders weren't a heiferess frame, they were the pillars of the hearth. She was a woman built for the long watch, for the heavy lift, for the storm that broke smaller things. She felt a fierce, soaring sense of belonging that had nothing to do with a contract and everything to do with the raw, untamed land outside. She was the match for this prairie. A sudden, sharp scratch sounded against the window pane. Evelina froze, her hand hovering over a tray of biscuits. It wasn't the wind. It was the first dry flakes of snow, driven by a sudden, violent gust. Within seconds, the scratching turned into a steady, rhythmic hiss. The storm had arrived. She walked to the window, peering out into the void. She couldn't see the barns anymore. She couldn't even see the fence line 10 feet away. The world was disappearing into a swirling, white madness. The house let out a long, low moan as the wind slammed into the western wall. Evelina didn't flinch. She leaned her forehead against the cold glass, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Let it come," she whispered, her voice a low, resonant vow that seemed to settle into the very foundation of the room. She turned back to the stove. She reached for the massive enameled percolator and began to grind the coffee beans, the sharp aromatic scent filling the air, a defiant challenge to the freezing dark. She was the mistress of Ironwood, the keeper of the fire and the provider of life. The silent war was over. The siege had begun, and she was ready to hold the line. At the top of the stairs, she knew Harlan was awake, listening to the same wind. She knew he was probably checking his Winchester, his mind on the cattle and the men. But she also knew that when he smelled the coffee rising through the floorboards in the dead of night, he would know that his fortress was occupied by a woman who wouldn't let it go cold. By 4 o'clock in the morning, the world outside the Ironwood main house had ceased to exist. The vast rolling valley, the jagged ridges, and the sturdy timber barns had all been swallowed by a howling horizontal wall of white madness. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed, a high-pitched predatory shriek that sought out every microscopic crack in the house's foundation, forcing the freezing breath of the tundra into the very marrow of the building. The snow was no longer falling in flakes. It was a deluge of ice shards piling in massive, undulating drifts that threatened to bury the porch and turn the house into a timber tomb. Inside, however, the kitchen was a defiant, glowing amber sanctuary. Evelina had not slept. She stood at the center of the room, her monumental frame silhouetted against the pulsing cherry-red heat of the massive black stove. The air was thick and heavy, a humid atmosphere saturated with the deep, fortifying sense of her labor, the sharp, acidic tang of dark-roasted coffee, the savory richness of fried salt pork, and the earthy, sweet aroma of the storm biscuit she had been baking in batches of 50. She moved with a steady, tireless precision, Her broad shoulders, though aching from 24 hours of constant motion, remained squared and powerful. She reached into the oven with a heavy padded cloth, pulling out a tray of dense, calorie-heavy hand pies, stuffed vekepte hat, seasoned beef and root vegetables. The heat from the oven washed over her face, but she didn't flinch. For the first time in her life, the sheer volume of her body felt like a reservoir of energy that the storm could not deplete. She was built for this siege. The heavy oak door to the hallway creaked open. Harlan Vance stepped into the kitchen, already dressed in his thickest woolens and high leather boots, his Winchester rifle gripped in one hand. He looked like a man preparing for a skirmish, his face a mask of cold, tactical assessment. But as he crossed the threshold and was hit by the sudden, overwhelming wall of heat and the scent of a fully operational kitchen, he stopped dead. His icy blue eyes swept over the room, the stacks of wrapped rations, the bubbling cauldron of coffee, and the monumental woman standing at the centre of it all, her apron stained with flour and soot, her presence more grounding than the very foundation of the house. "You reawake," Harlan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that barely carried over the roar of the wind against the walls. Mott thought Mott smelled the coffee through the floorboards. What did they know to think any living soul could have stayed standing through this night? Evelina turned, her dark eyes bright with a fierce, vibrating energy. She didn't look like a weary servant. She looked like the commander of a fortress. "The storm does sleep, Harlan, so neither does the hearth," she replied, her voice resonant and steady. Mort packed 3 dozen rations in waxcloth and wool. "If the men can make it to the house, we have to get the fuel to them. A man can freeze on a full stomach, but he luglunt die twice as fast on an empty one." Harlan walked toward the window, peering out into the blinding, swirling void. The drifts are already 4 feet high against the mudroom door. Silas and Toby are in the bunkhouse, but the north stable is isolated. Mort have to get out there to check the lines. He turned back to her, and for a fleeting second, the stoic monster of Ironwood looked at Mort, his wife, with a vulnerability that was almost painful. He saw the sheer, magnificent substance of her, the way she took up space not as a burden, but as a pillar. He realized that if he went out into that white hell, he was leaving the heart of his world in the hands of the only person strong enough to hold it. "Stay inside." "Evelina," Harlan commanded, though his tone was laced with a newfound, desperate respect. "The wind is turning. It's a blue norther now. If the fire goes out, the house will be a freezer in an hour." "The fire will not go out," Evelina vowed, her voice as ironclad as the stove. Suddenly, a frantic, muffled pounding erupted from the back door, not the main entry, but the small mudroom hatch. It was a desperate, hollow sound, nearly drowned out by the gale. Harlan reacted instantly, his rifle raised as he lunged for the door. He threw his weight against the timber, fighting the mountain of snow that had piled against the exterior. With a violent heave, the door swung open, admitting a freezing, blinding vortex of white and a stumbling, ice-covered figure that collapsed onto the floorboards. It was Miller. The man was unrecognizable. His beard was a jagged mask of icicle, his skin a terrifying shade of waxy grey. He was shivering so violently that his teeth rattled like dry bones. He had crawled from the bunkhouse, a distance of only 50 yards that had nearly claimed his life. "The stove," Miller gasped, his voice a broken, frozen rasp. "The chimney in the bunkhouse." It collapsed under the weight. "Silas. He is trying to keep the boys moving, but we re-losing the heat. We re-freezing, boss. We re-freezing in the dark." Harlan's jaw tightened. He looked at the swirling abyss outside, then at the half-frozen man at his feet. The situation had turned from a tactical challenge into a lethal crisis. Evelina didn't wait for an order. She didn't scream or panic. She moved with a monumental, decisive speed. She grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the hearth and wrapped it around Miller's shivering frame, then reached for a mug of the pitch black, scalding coffee. "Drink," she commanded, her voice cutting through Miller's delirium like a beacon. She looked up at Harlan, her eyes burning with a strategic fire. "We can bring them all here in this wind, and they can stay there. We need the sled, Harlan. We load the sled with the hot stones from the stove, the wrapped rations, and the extra blankets. You and Miller follow the guide rope back to the bunkhouse. Mot luglunk keep the soup boiling every 30 minutes. Mot want a signal. If Mot don't hear that bell, Mot met coming out after you." Harlan looked at his wife, the heavy girl from Oakhaven, and saw the only general he had ever trusted. He gave her a single, sharp nod of absolute submission to her competence. "Load the sled," Harlan said. The siege had truly begun, and the mistress of Ironwood was no longer just cooking, she was conducting a rescue. The air in the mudroom was a violent, clashing threshold between two worlds. Behind Evelina, the kitchen roared with the life-giving heat of the stove, a golden sanctuary of yeast and fire. In front of her, through the half-open door that Harlan was straining to hold against the gale, lay a howling white abyss that felt like the end of the world. The blue norther had transformed the familiar ranch yard into a treacherous, shifting landscape of ice shards and lethal drifts. Evelina moved with a ferocious, monumental speed that left no room for hesitation. She didn't look like a woman, she looked like a force of nature meeting its match. She grabbed several massive, smooth river stones she kept at the base of the stove for heat retention, and, using heavy leather mitts, began to wrap them in thick layers of scorched burlap. These were not just rocks, they were portable reservoirs of life, thermal anchors that would provide the only warmth the men in the bunkhouse would have once their own fire died. The sled. "Harlan. Now," she shouted, her voice easily piercing the high-pitched shriek of the wind. Harlan dragged the heavy timber supply sled into the mudroom, his face caked in a mask of frost that made him look like a carved marble statue. Miller lay shivering in the corner, wrapped in 3 layers of wool, his eyes wide and vacant with the onset of hypothermia. Evelina didn't ask for help. She hoisted the 50-pound sacks of storm rations, the wrapped biscuits, the dried beef, and the heavy tins of concentrated sugared coffee, and dropped them onto the sled with a series of rhythmic heavy thuds. Each movement was a display of the sheer, magnificent substance of her frame. Her broad shoulders, once the target of Melissa's cruel jokes, were now the only pulleys capable of loading the lifeline. She followed the food with the hot stones, layering them at the bottom of the sled to create a radiating floor of heat. Mott tied the guide rope to the porch pillar. Harlan grunted, his breath hitching as he tightened the cinch on the supply bags. He looked up at Evelina, and for the first time he didn't see his wife. He saw a partner in arms. The monster of Ironwood found himself standing in the shadow of a woman who was just as formidable, just as unyielding, and infinitely more resourceful. "If we lose the rope, we don't come back, Evelina. Do you understand?" Evelina reached out, her thick, flour-dusted hand gripping Harlan's wool-clad forearm. Her grip was like a vice, steady and grounding. "You will not lose the rope, because Mott will be holding the other end of it from the door," she vowed, her dark eyes burning with a strategic, protective fire. "And Miller, if you stop moving, if you let him fall, don't bother coming back for the coffee. Mort don't he feed ghosts." Miller gave a spasmodic, shivering nod, the terrifying reality of his situation finally cutting through the fog of the cold. With a violent heave, Harlan and Miller pushed the sled out into the white out. The wind immediately tried to swallow them, the horizontal snow erasing their forms within 3 feet of the threshold. Evelina stood in the doorway, her monumental frame braced against the frame, the freezing spray hitting her face like 1,000 needle pricks. She held the thick hemp guide rope in her bare, powerful hands, feeling the rhythmic, desperate tugging as the men fought their way toward the bunkhouse. Every inch the rope moved was a testament to the battle being waged in the dark. Evelina didn't flinch. She stood like a monolithic sentry, her broad back absorbing the draft, her muscles coiled and ready. She was the anchor. She was the bridge between the fire and the frost. In that moment, standing in the teeth of the deadliest storm the territory had seen in a decade, Evelina felt a profound, crystalline sense of peace. She wasn't the clumsy girl from Oakhaven anymore. She wasn't the burden. She was the only thing standing between 20 men and a cold, forgotten death. Her size, her strength, her very existence was the price of their survival. The rope went slack. Then, 3 sharp, rhythmic tugs. They had reached the bunkhouse. Evelina didn't celebrate. She stepped back into the kitchen, slammed the heavy oak door, and bolted it with a metallic clack that echoed like a gunshot. She was alone in the house now, the sole keeper of the flame. She didn't sit down. She didn't weep. She turned back to the stove, grabbed the heavy iron poker, and stoked the fire until the grate glowed a fierce, defiant orange. She had 20 men to keep alive, and she had a husband to bring home. The silent war was over. This was a siege of the soul, and the mistress of Ironwood had only duete begun to fight. She reached for the next bushel of potatoes, the rhythmic thwack of her knife against the wooden block, a steady, unbreakable drumbeat against the screaming wind. The silence that descended upon the Ironwood kitchen after the heavy oak door clicked shut was not a peaceful one. It was a thick, vibrating vacuum filled with the muffled, rhythmic screaming of the wind and the agonizing structural groans of the timber beams as they fought the weight of the encroaching drifts. Without the presence of the men, the room felt cavernous, a vast stage of amber light and shifting shadows where Evelina stood as the sole protagonist against the frozen void. She did not allow herself the luxury of a chair. She did not even lean against the work table. She stood in the center of the room, her monumental frame rooted to the pine floorboards like a centennial oak. The heat from the massive black stove radiated against her skin, drawing out a fine sheen of sweat that made her cotton chemise cling to her broad shoulders. In the flickering light of the hearth, she looked less like a ranch wife, and more like a blacksmith of the soul, forging survival out of the raw materials of flour, water, and iron will. Evelina reached for a massive wooden bowl and a bushel of winter-hardened carrots and parsnips. She began to chop, her thick, capable fingers moving with a surgical precision that seemed almost hypnotic in the quiet. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound of the knife against the heavy butcher block became a defiant counter-rhythm to the wind's erratic howling. As she worked, her mind drifted back to the small, cramped kitchen of the Oakhaven boarding house. She remembered the way Mrs. Gable would sigh. They kept itehat performative exhaustion every time Evelina walked through a doorway, as if her very presence were a physical tax on the roomless air. She remembered the stinging shame of being told to step lightly and shrink back, as if her strength were a shameful secret to be hidden behind lace and silence. But here, in the howling heart of a blue norther, that strength was the only currency that mattered. Evelina paused, her hand resting on the heavy iron handle of the cauldron. She looked at her arms, broad, muscular, and dusted with the white powder of the morning baking. She looked at her hands, scarred by labour and reddened by the cold. For the first time in 22 years, she didn't see too much. She saw just enough. She realized with a profound, bone-deep clarity that her body had not been a mistake of nature. It had been a preparation. She was built with this specific architecture because only a frame of this magnitude could carry the weight of ironwood through a night like this. They looked at a queen and saw a maid, she whispered to the empty room. Her voice a low, resonant alto that felt more solid than the timber walls. They looked at a fortress and saw a burden. She reached for a massive beef bone, thick with marrow, and dropped it into the simmering pot. The heavy splash of the water was a satisfying sound of replenishment. She began to stir the soup, a concoction of beef, root vegetables, and thick, hand-torn dumplings. It was a meal designed to thicken the blood and restart a man's internal furnace. She didn't measure the seasoning. She tasted the steam, her instincts guiding her toward a richness that would feel like a physical embrace to the men huddled in the bunkhouse. The wind slammed into the side of the house with a force that made the copper pots on the ceiling chime like funeral bells. A fine dusting of snow hissed through a microscopic gap in the window frame, landing on the hot stove and vanishing in a tiny puff of steam. Evelina didn't flinch. She simply walked to the wood box, hoisted 3 more massive oak logs, a weight that would have required 2 of the smaller ranch hands to carry, and fed the fire. The flames roared with a renewed, predatory appetite, casting her long, monumental shadow across the ceiling. She was alone, but she was not lonely. She felt a strange electric connection to the men on the other end of that guide rope. She was the anchor point. Every stir of her spoon, every log she threw into the fire was a pulse of life sent down the line. She was the mistress of Ironwood, and she would hold this hearth until the sun broke the white out, or until her own heart ceased its rhythmic labour. She sat down for the first time in 6 hours, not to rest, but to sharpen her knife. The rhythmic shh of the steel against the whetstone was the only melody in the dark. She was ready for the next tug on the rope. She was ready for whatever the storm brought to her door. The rope began to dance. Evelina was across the kitchen, pouring the thick, marrow-rich beef stock into a secondary cauldron when she heard the distinct, frantic rattling of the iron hook on the mudroom door. It wasn't the steady 3-beat signal of a successful arrival. It was a rhythmic, desperate jerking that sent a cold spike of adrenaline through her veins. The hemp line, thick as a man's thumb, was vibrating with the tension of a struggle occurring somewhere in the blinding white madness outside. She dropped the ladle, the heavy silver clattering against the zinc, and moved with a monumental earth-shaking speed toward the door. She didn't pause to grab a shawl or a coat. She threw her weight against the heavy oak slab, her broad shoulders groaning as she fought the mountain of snow that had drifted nearly 5 feet high against the exterior. With a guttural cry of exertion, she forced the door open just enough to see a gloved hand gripping the guide rope, followed by the ghost of a silhouette. Harlan Vance emerged from the void like a man returning from the dead. He was hunched over, his massive frame nearly doubled by the sheer force of the gale. He was T alone. He was dragging Miller, who had apparently lost consciousness or the use of his legs, and behind them, staggering like a wounded animal, was Silas. Evelina reached out into the freezing vortex. She didn't wait for them to climb the steps. She grabbed Harlan by the collar of his ice-crusted duster and hauled him upward with a display of raw, terrifying strength that made the timber porch creak. She reached down again, her thick fingers sinking into the wool of Silas' coat, and hoisted the foreman into the mudroom as if he were a sack of grain. She slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. The silence that followed, so sudden it felt like a physical blow. The 3 men collapsed onto the rugs, a heap of frost, leather, and laboured, rattling breath. The mudroom, though insulated, felt like a freezer, but as the warmth of the main kitchen began to seep through the inner door, the ice on their beards began to weep, turning into dark, jagged streaks against their grey skin. Harlan sat up first, his breath coming in ragged, white plumes. He looked at his hands, which were shaking so violently he couldn't unbuckle his own gun belt. He looked up at Evelina, his icy blue eyes bloodshot and haunted. The wind. It turned, Harlan rasped, his voice a broken whisper of its former self. The rope. We almost lost it. Silas found us 10 yards out. The bunkhouse is stable for now, thanks to the stones, but they can stay there if the drifts keep rising. We had to. We had to get back. Evelina didn't waste time with words of comfort. She moved into the kitchen and returned with a heavy ceramic bowl filled with the steaming marrow soup. The scent was a violent, intoxicating contrast to the smell of ozone and death the men had brought in with them. "Drink," she commanded, kneeling beside Silas first. The foreman was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking together in a rhythmic, terrifying staccato. She held the bowl to his lips. Her thick, steady hand acting as a brace. As the hot, savoury liquid hit Silas' throat, he let out a long, shuddering groan. The colour began to creep back into his waxen cheeks, a faint, mottled red. He looked at Evelina, the woman he had cautiously respected, the woman the men had mocked, and his eyes filled vacapte at a sudden, profound clarity. You, Silas, managed to choke out between swallows. You kept the line. Mort felt the tension. If you hadn't held the anchor, we'd be under 5 feet of white by now. Evelina didn't answer. She moved to Harlan. He refused the bowl at first, his pride fighting the instinct to surrender, but she didn't give him a choice. She pressed the warmth against his chest, her monumental presence a wall of heat that he couldn't retreat from. Mort and the anchor. Harlan, she whispered, her voice a low, resonant vow that anchored the room better than the timber beams ever could. Mort told you I wouldn't let the fire go out. Now drink, before Mort have to pour it down your throat myself. Harlan took the bowl, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric, the biting cold of his skin meeting the furnace-like heat of hers. He drank, the rich, salty broth restarting his internal machinery, and as he did, he looked at her broad shoulders, her flour-stained apron, and the sheer magnificent scale of her strength. He realized then that the rescue hadn't happened in the yard. It had happened here in the kitchen hours ago when she decided she was enough to hold the world together. The monster of Ironwood reached out and rested his heavy, damp hand on her forearm. It wasn't a gesture of a master to a servant. It was the touch of a man acknowledging his saviour. Miller needs the hearth, Harlan said, his voice regaining a sliver of its gravelly authority. We have to move him closer to the stove. Evelina stood up, her frame casting a long, protective shadow over the 3 broken men. Move him. You and Silas get to the fire. There are dry clothes on the rack and more soup in the cauldron. The night is only half over, and Mort haven't even started on the coffee. She leaned down and with a grunt of focused exertion lifted the unconscious Miller into her arms. She carried him into the kitchen as if he weighed no more than a child, her broad back straight, her stride certain. She was no longer just the woman who cooked the meals. She was the fortress, and tonight the fortress was the only place where the world hadn't ended. The kitchen had transformed once again, shifting from a factory of calories into a dimly lit, humid infirmary. The air was no longer just thick with the smell of stew. It was layered with the sharp, medicinal sting of turpentine, the heavy scent of rendered tallow, and the herbal sweetness of the dried lavender Evelina had steeped in boiling water to soothe the men's scorched lungs. The massive black stove continued to pulse with a relentless cherry-red heat, its iron plates groaning as if it too were exhausted by the effort of holding the night at bay. Evelina knelt on the floor beside Miller, her monumental frame casting a shadow that reached across the ceiling like a guardian spirit. She had stripped away the man's frozen boots and socks, her thick, steady fingers working with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands of her size. Miller's feet were a terrifying waxy white, the skin as hard as marble. She didn't use direct heat. She knew that would shatter the skin like glass. Instead, she used the warmth of her own body. She rubbed her broad, powerful palms together until they were glowing with friction, then began to massage his feet with a slow, agonizingly steady pressure, using a mixture of lard and wintergreen. Harlan and Silas sat at the table, their silhouettes hunched and weary. They were stripped to their undershirts, heavy wool blankets draped over their broad shoulders. They watched her in a silence so profound it felt like a prayer. They watched the way her shoulders, the shoulders they had mocked for their width, braced against the floor as she worked. They watched the way her hands, the hands they had called clumsy, moved with the precision of a clockmaker and the tenderness of a mother. Silas broke the silence first. His voice was a ragged, hollow rasp, the sound of a man whose pride had been stripped away by the wind. Morth spent 20 years on the trail. Mrs. Vance, Silas murmured, his eyes fixed on the rhythmic motion of her arms. Seen men die of the cold in the time it takes to saddle a horse. Mort fee seen foreman break and owners run for the cellar when the blue norther screams. He paused, a fit of coughing racking his chest before he could continue. Evelina didn't look up, but she reached back with one hand and slid a mug of warm, honeyed cider toward him without breaking her rhythm on Miller's frostbitten skin. Silas took a shuddering breath and looked at Harlan, then back at Evelina. This morning, near the pump house, I let those boys talk. Mort let 'em say things that had no business being spoken on a decent ranch. Mort called you a prize heifer myself, thinking Mort was being clever, thinking Mort knew what a woman was supposed to look like. Evelina's hands faltered for a fraction of a second, the only sign she had heard him. The sting of the memory was there, but it was distant now, a dull throb compared to the vital work before her. They looked at you and saw a burden because you were bigger than their narrow little lives. Ma'am, Silas continued, his voice trembling with a raw, agonizing sincerity. But tonight, out there in the white out, when the rope went taut and Mut felt the strength on the other end of it, Mut dared not see a heifer, Mut saw the only thing in this territory strong enough to be an anchor. If you hadn't been built the way you are, if you hadn't had the shoulders to hold that line and the heart to stay by this stove, we'd all be frozen meat by sunrise. Silas leaned forward, his scarred face illuminated by the hearth. Mort met an old fool, Mrs. Vance, and on behalf of every man on this ranch who laughed, Mort met sorry. You aren't the mistress of Ironwood because Harlan Vance bought you a ring. You re the mistress because you re the only one among us who's truly monumental. Evelina finally looked up. Her face was smudged Vakeptihat soot and damp with sweat, her hair a wild dark tangle around her head. She looked at the hardened foreman, seeing the genuine shivering humility in his eyes. The silent war wasn't just won, it had ended in a total unconditional surrender of their prejudice. The apology is noted, Silas, Evelina said, her voice a low resonant alto that hummed with authority. But save your breath for breathing. Miller's blood is starting to move, but the storm is getting louder. Mott needs you and Harlan to move the kitchen table against the mudroom door. The wind is trying to find the latch, and Mott want tea have the cold in my kitchen. Harlan stood up, his icy blue eyes burning with a fierce, prideful heat as he looked at his wife. He didn't say a word, but the way he looked at her broad, capable frame was a tribute more powerful than any speech. He stepped toward the table, and Silas, despite his exhaustion, stood with him. They moved the heavy oak furniture with a rhythmic communal effort, bolting the fortress against the night. Evelina turned back to Miller, her heart feeling as large and as warm as the stove itself. She was just a woman who took up space. She was the woman who defined it. And as the wind shrieked against the timber, trying to break its way in, the mistress of Ironwood simply leaned into her work, knowing that as long as she remained standing, the fire would never go out. The middle of the night, that hollow, weightless stretch between 3 and 4 in the morning, was the most dangerous hour of the Blue Norther. The wind had shifted from a scream to a low predatory growl, a sound that vibrated through the very floorboards and rattled the heavy copper pots hanging from the rafters. Outside, the world was a featureless, swirling void of white, but inside the kitchen the air was thick, humid and heavy with the scent of survival. Evelina remained the only soul truly awake in the vastness of the house. Miller had been moved to a pallet of blankets near the base of the stove, his breathing finally shifting from a ragged, frozen rasp to a deep, restorative snore. Silas and Harlan were slumped in the heavy oak chairs at the table, their heads bowed in the brutal sleep of the utterly exhausted, the blankets draped over their broad shoulders rising and falling in a rhythmic, somber unison. Evelina stood at the centre of the room, her monumental frame silhouetted against the pulsing cherry-red glow of the hearth. She didn't feel the weight of the long watch in her bones. Instead, she felt a strange electric clarity. Her broad shoulders, once a source of crushing shame, now felt like the very pillars of the firmament. She moved to the stove, her movements silent and powerful. She grabbed the heavy iron poker and stoked the embers, the sparks dancing in her dark eyes like miniature stars. She fed the fire 3 more massive logs of seasoned oak, the flames roaring with a renewed defiant appetite that cast her long protective shadow across the ceiling. She reached for the sourdough crock, the living heart of her kitchen. Even in the midst of a life and death struggle, the bread didn't wait. She began to knead a fresh batch of dough for the morning, her thick, capable hands moving vekep a mesmerizing rhythmic strength. Fold, thud. The sound was a heartbeat, a physical manifestation of her resolve. She wasn't just making food. She was ensuring that when the sun finally broke through the white out, the men would wake to the scent of home, not the scent of a tomb. "You should sleep, Evelina." The voice was a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the hiss of the wind. Harlan had not moved his head from his arms, but his icy blue eyes were open, watching her from the shadows of his blanket. Evelina didn't break her rhythm. She drove the heels of her hands into the elastic dough, her monumental frame swaying with the effort. "Sleep is a luxury for those who don't have a fire to tend, Harlan," she replied, her voice a rich, resonant alto. "The wind is dying down, but the cold will be at its sharpest duet before dawn. If I stop now, the house will lose its heat, and Miller want to wake up. Mort told you, I don't feed ghosts." Harlan slowly straightened his back, his muscles groaning with the effort. He shed the blanket and stood up, his massive frame towering over the table, yet in the presence of his wife, he no longer felt like the sole authority of Ironwood. He walked toward her, the smell of the freezing prairie still clinging to his undershirt, and stopped just inches away. The heat from the stove and the warmth radiating from her skin created a small private climate between them. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers hesitating before they gently brushed a stray lock of dark, damp hair from her forehead. His touch was electric, a raw acknowledgement of the bond forged in the crucible of the night. "Silas told me what he said to you," Harlan murmured, his gaze intense and searching. "About the prize heifer, about the mockery." Evelina paused her kneading, her hands sinking into the warm dough. She looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. The sting of the insults was gone, replaced by a profound, unshakable sense of her own substance. He apologized. "Harlan." He saw the anchor. "He saw what Mott saw from the moment you stepped off that stagecoach," Harlan corrected her, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than the wind. "They looked at your size and saw a problem to be managed. Mott looked at you and saw the only woman in this territory with the architecture to match this land. Mott dade not want a parlor ornament, Evelina. Mott wanted a foundation stone, and tonight you held the entire world on your shoulders." Evelina's breath hitched. For 22 years, she had been told she was too much, too large, too strong, too formidable. But in the quiet of this frozen night, she realized that she was exactly the right scale for the life she had claimed. She wasn't a burden, she was the solution. She reached out, her flour-dusted hand resting briefly on Harlan's forearm. The contact was brief, but it carried the weight of a finalized treaty. "The water is heating for the coffee," she said, her voice regaining its steady, executive edge to hide the sudden flutter in her chest. "Go wake Silas. We have to prepare for the morning. The men in the bunkhouse will be waking up in a freezing room, and they need to know the house is still standing. Mort want the first batch of biscuits out of the oven by 5. Harlan looked at her for a long moment, a slow, deeply respectful smile touching the corners of his mouth, the first true smile she had seen from him. He gave her a single, sharp nod of absolute submission to her command. "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. As Harlan moved to wake the foreman, Evelina turned back to her dough, The first hint of a grey pre-dawn light was beginning to touch the frost on the windows, a sign that the white night was finally coming to an end. She was exhausted, her body ached, and her hands were raw, but as she shaped the loaves, she felt a soaring, magnificent sense of belonging. The silent war was over, the siege had been held, and as the sun prepared to rise over the Ironwood Empire, the mistress of Ironwood knew that she had finally found a space large enough to hold her heart. The dawn that followed the white night did not arrive with a triumphant burst of gold. Instead, it bled slowly into the world as a bruised, ethereal violet, a pale and ghostly light that revealed the true, terrifying scale of the storm's wrath. The Ironwood Valley had been transformed into a crystalline, alien landscape. Massive, undulating drifts of snow, some reaching 10 feet high, had sculpted the yard into a series of jagged white waves, burying the fence lines and turning the sturdy timber barns into half-submerged islands in a frozen sea. The wind had finally surrendered its predatory scream, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt heavy, a ringing stillness that made the occasional crack of a freezing tree branch sound like a rifle shot. Inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was the polar opposite of the desolate void outside. It was a dense, humid sanctuary of life. The massive black stove was no longer just an appliance. It had become the pulsing, incandescent heart of the entire ranch. The iron plates shimmered with a dull, radiant heat that kept the encroaching frost at a respectful distance from the window panes. Evelina stood at the center of this golden kingdom, her monumental silhouette cast in long, flickering shadows against the timber walls. She had not slept for over 30 hours, yet as she pulled the final tray of morning biscuits from the oven, her movements remained steady, powerful, and devoid of the frantic edge of exhaustion. The heat of the kitchen had settled into her skin, giving her a healthy, vibrant flush that made her dark eyes burn with a fierce, quiet electricity. She reached for a massive wooden bowl of whipped honey butter she had prepared, her thick fingers moving with a tireless grace. She wasn't just a woman cooking breakfast anymore. She was an architect of morale, a provider of the very fuel required to reclaim the ranch from the ice. The heavy mudroom door creaked open, admitting a brief, violent swirl of freezing air before Harlan and Silas managed to force it shut. They had been outside for an hour, using heavy timber shovels to clear a trench through the drifts to the bunkhouse. They were caked in a fine layer of white powder, their faces caked in frost, but as they stepped into the main kitchen, they both stopped dead in their tracks. The scent hit them like a physical embrace, the intoxicating, yeasty warmth of the sourdough, the savoury hand-crumbled sausage gravy bubbling in the iron cauldron, and the sharp, life-giving aroma of dark roasted coffee. But more than the smell, it was the sight of Evelina. She stood at the head of the table, her broad shoulders squared, her monumental frame silhouetted against the roaring hearth. She looked like a queen who had just successfully defended her fortress from a siege. "The trench is clear," Harlan murmured, his voice a low, gravelly vibration of exhaustion and profound respect. He stripped away his ice-crusted gloves, his icy blue eyes locking onto his wife. "The men are coming through now. They reek old, Evelina. They reek old to the soul." "Then they come to the right place, Harlan," Evelina replied, her voice a rich, resonant alto that seemed to anchor the very floorboards. "Tell them to leave their gear in the mudroom. Mortvair laid out dry wool blankets near the stove. Mortvair kept inerte them fed and warmed before a single man picks up a shovel to clear the stables." As if on cue, the first of the ranch hands began to file in. These were hardened, cynical men who had spent the night huddling around a dying fire in a freezing bunkhouse, listening to the wind try to tear their roof off. They entered the kitchen with a tentative, almost reverent caution. They didn't look for a place to make a joke. They looked at the woman standing by the stove with an expression of stunned, shivering gratitude. Jake, the man who had mocked her as a prize heifer only 24 hours ago, was among the first. He was shivering so violently that his spurs made a frantic metallic chattering against the floor. He stopped near the hearth, the heat of the stove hitting him like a miracle. He looked at Evelina, at her broad, capable arms, her soot-stained apron, and the sheer magnificent substance of her presence, and his eyes filled vacate at a sudden watery clarity. "Ma'am," Jake whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't have a joke. He didn't have a sneer. He simply bowed his head in a gesture of absolute, undeniable submission to her competence. Evelina did demand an apology. She didn't to need one. The power dynamic of Ironwood had shifted irrevocably during the night. She reached for a heavy ceramic mug, filled it with the scalding, pitch-black coffee, and handed it to him. Her thick, steady hand didn't waver. "Drink, Jake," she commanded gently. "The biscuits are coming out now. Sit near Miller. He needs the company." One by one, the men took their places at the long oak table. The silent war was over. The kitchen was no longer a place of service, it was the seat of power. Evelina moved around the table, ladling out the thick gravy and handing out the golden, flaky bread. She moved with the fluid, powerful grace of a woman who finally understood that her size was not a burden to be hidden, but a fortress to be shared. Silas sat at the end of the table, watching her with a quiet, somber pride. He looked at Harlan, and the two men shared a silent, profound acknowledgement. They had both survived the night because of the woman with the broad shoulders and the iron will. Evelina stood at the head of the table, her hands resting on her hips, her monumental frame radiating a heat that was more than just physical. She looked at her empire, the fed men, the warm house, the husband who looked at her with a fierce, protective awe, and she realized that she was no longer the girl who took up too much space. She was the only one big enough to hold it all together. The kitchen was a landscape of steam and heavy rhythmic chewing, a sound that to a woman like Evelina was the most sincere form of applause. The 20 men gathered around the long oak table were no longer the jagged, cynical outcasts who had ridden into Ironwood with frost in their hearts and mockery on their tongues. They were a collective, subdued by the sheer overwhelming competence of the woman standing at the stove. The fortress had not only held the line against the storm, it had opened its gates and offered a salvation that tasted of golden sourdough and marrow-rich gravy. Harlan Vance sat at the head of the table, his massive frame still radiating a lingering chill from the yard, but his icy blue eyes were fixed entirely on his wife. He watched the way she moved, the fluid, powerful grace of her broad shoulders as she ladled out second helpings, the steady, rhythmic jingling of the iron keys at her waist, and the quiet, monumental dignity in her every gesture. He saw the way the men looked at her now, not with the predatory assessment of the streets, but with the wide-eyed, shivering reverence usually reserved for a miracle. Harlan cleared his throat. A low, gravelly sound that instantly silenced the room. The clatter of forks against ceramic ceased. The men looked up, their faces flushed from the heat, waiting for the word of the master of Ironwood. Harlan didn't stand, but his presence seemed to expand, filling the room with the weight of his authority. He looked down the length of the table, his gaze lingering on Miller, who was now awake and leaning against the warm stone of the hearth, and then on Jake, whose head was bowed in a lingering, visible shame. "We survived the night," Harlan began, his voice a resonant thrum that anchored the silence. "We survived it because we have timber walls, because we have a guide rope, and because we have the luck of the devil. But mostly, we survived it because of the woman standing at that stove." He turned his head slowly, looking at Evelina. For the first time in front of his crew, he didn't address her as a subordinate or a silent partner. He looked at her as a sovereign. "Mort heard the whispers near the pump house yesterday morning," Harlan continued, his voice dropping into a razor-thin, dangerous register that made more than one man flinch. Mott heard the jokes about prize heifers and barns. Mott heard the small-minded cowardice of men who think a woman's worth is measured by how little space she takes up in the world. The silence in the kitchen became absolute, save for the crackle of the fire. Let it be understood here and now, from the fence line to the Heart to Gohat Ridge, Harlan declared, his voice rising with an ironclad finality. This kitchen is not a scullery, and Mrs. Vance is not a servant. She is the mistress of Ironwood. Her word carries the same weight as mine. If she commands the woodbox filled, you fill it. If she tells you the yard is closed, you stay out, and if Mott hears so much as a whispered syllable of disrespect toward her again, you want to just be off this land. You'll be answering to the man who brought the foundation stone home. Evelina felt a sudden, sharp surge of heat in her chest, a radiant, soaring pride that was more intense than any flame in the stove. She didn't shrink under the collective gaze of the men. She stood tall, her broad shoulders squared, her dark eyes meeting Harlan's with a fierce, vibrating gratitude. For 22 years she had been a problem to be hidden. Today she was a power to be reckoned with. Silas was the first to react. He stood up, his heavy chair scraping against the pine floor. He didn't look at Harlan, he looked directly at Evelina. He took off his hat, clutching it against his chest, and gave her a deep, unmistakable nod of absolute, formal allegiance. "The boss is right," Silas grunted, his voice thick with sincerity. "We were fools, ma'am. We looked at the mountain and complained about the climb, never realizing it was the only thing keeping the wind off our backs. You saved our lives last night. My hat is off to you, and my back is yours for whatever heavy lifting needs doing." One by one, the other men followed suit. A wave of somber, respectful nods rippling down the table. There was no mockery left in the room. There was only the profound, shivering recognition that the woman they had mocked was the only reason they were still breathing. Evelina wiped her hands on her apron, the iron keys jingling with a musical, triumphant finality. "Eat your fill, men," she said, her voice a low, resonant alto that hummed with a new, reinforced authority. "The storm has passed, but the work is only beginning. Mott want the first team on the stables in 20 minutes. Mott Luglunk have the midday stew ready when the sun hits the meridian. And Jake." The man looked up, startled. The afternoon following the great storm was defined by a rhythmic, industrious energy that Ironwood had never witnessed before. Outside, the world remained a blinding, frozen white, but the trench between the kitchen and the bunkhouse was now a well-beaten path. The men, fueled by the heavy midday stew and the newfound fire in their spirits, worked with a ferocity that matched the blizzard's own strength. But the most striking change was to the speed of their shovels. It was the direction of their attention. Every hour the woodbox by the kitchen door was topped off with fresh, dry cedar and oak without Evelina having to utter a single command. The heavy iron water pails were kept perpetually full. When Toby struggled to hoist a frozen crate of apples from the cellar, two of the older hands, men who previously would have watched the boy struggle with a sneer, leaped to assist him, their eyes darting toward the kitchen window to see if the mistress was watching. They weren't just working for Harlan anymore, they were working for the woman who kept the hearth. Inside, Evelina moved through her domain Vekep-Tehat, a serene, monumental authority. The air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, cloves, and the tart, sharp aroma of the winter apples she was slicing. She was preparing the promised pies, not as a reward for their obedience, but as a celebration of their shared survival. Her broad, powerful hands moved with a hypnotic precision, peeling and coring the fruit, her fingers nimble despite their size. Harlan returned to the house as the sun began its final bruised descent toward the horizon. He entered through the mudroom, but this time he didn't look like a man braced for battle. He looked like a man coming home. He stripped off his heavy coat and stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Evelina as she rolled out a sheet of flaky, lard-rich pastry. The silence between them was no longer the strained, hollow quiet of two strangers tied by a contract. It was a rich, vibrating stillness, filled with the heat of the stove and the burgeoning weight of their mutual respect. "The south stable is clear," Harlan said, his voice dropping into that low, intimate rumble that always seemed to vibrate in Evelina's chest. "The cattle are hunkered down, but we did lose a single head. Silas says he's never seen the men work like this. They were talking about the Ironwood Empress as if you'd been here for a century." Evelina didn't look up from her pastry, a faint, radiant smile touching her lips. They were just realizing that a full belly is a better motivator than a sharp tongue. Harlan. They needed to know they belonged to something worth saving. Harlan walked across the kitchen, his boots silent on the rugs. He stopped behind her, his monumental frame casting a shadow over the work table. He didn't touch her, but the heat radiating from his body felt like a physical embrace. They aren't the only ones who realized something today, Harlan murmured. Evelina paused, the rolling pin resting against the dough. She turned slowly, her dark eyes meeting his icy blue gaze. In the flickering light of the lanterns, Harlan's face looked softer, the harsh lines of the frontier smoothed by a profound, raw sincerity. Mort built this house to be a fortress, Evelina, he whispered, stepping closer until only a sliver of air remained between them. Mott filled it with books, with fine walnut, and with gold. I thought that was enough to keep the world out. But Mott was wrong. A fortress is just a cold pile of timber until someone like you brings the fire. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently cupping her jaw. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone, his touch surprisingly tender for a man built of such iron will. You told me once that you were too much for Oakhaven, Harlan said, his voice thick with emotion. But the truth is, Evelina, Oakhaven was too small for you. This valley, this ranch, it has the only space in the territory large enough to hold the heart you have. Mort day, no to just find a foundation stone, Mort found the soul of my empire. Evelina's breath hitched, her monumental frame trembling slightly at the sheer weight of his words. For 22 years she had been told she was a burden to be tolerated. Now the most formidable man she had ever known was telling her she was the very reason his world made sense. She leaned into his touch, her broad hand reaching up to rest against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heart beneath the wool of his shirt. Mort meant not going anywhere. Harlan, she vowed, her voice a low, resonant anchor. The storm can scream all it wants. As long as Mortam's standing, this hearth thus stays warm. Harlan leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. They stood there in the center of the kitchen, the monster and the fortress, two souls who had finally found the one person strong enough to match their scale. The silent war was truly over, replaced by a peace that promised to be as enduring as the ridges themselves. The evening meal was not a boisterous affair, but it possessed a weight, a gravity of shared triumph that resonated through the thick timber walls of the Ironwood main house. Outside, the world was still a crystalline, dangerous void, but inside, the kitchen had become the literal center of the universe. The 20 Re-Anoche hat hands sat at the long oak table, their faces clean, their spirits fortified. But the centerpiece of the night was not the beef stew or the coffee. It was the 4 massive apple pies sitting on the sideboard, their lattice crusts a perfect burnished gold, steam still curling from the vents like incense. Evelina moved among them, her monumental frame radiating a calm, unshakable authority. She didn't wait for them to finish their stew. She took a heavy silver knife and began to slice into the first pie. The snap of the lard-rich crust and the sudden violent burst of cinnamon and sweet tart apple scent made more than one man close his eyes in involuntary bliss. She served Miller first. The man who had almost been lost to the frost sat nearest the stove, his feet wrapped in clean wool. As Evelina set a jagged, steaming wedge of pie before him, Miller looked up. His eyes were no longer clouded by the petty mockery of a street thug. They were bright with a raw, shivering gratitude. "Ma'am," Miller whispered, his voice still a bit rasping from the cold. He looked at his own scarred, thick hands, then at hers. "Mott spent my life thinking the world only had room for the small and the fast. But Mott, reckon Mott was wrong. If you weren't exactly the size you are, if you hadn't had the strength to hold that rope and the heart to stay by this fire, Mott, be a memory in a drift tonight. Thank you for the pie and for the life." A murmur of agreement rippled down the table, a low, resonant sound of men acknowledging a queen. One by one they ate, the silence in the room filled only by the rhythmic scraping of forks and the satisfied sighs of the weary. They weren't just eating a dessert. They were consuming the proof of their own salvation. Evelina didn't retreat to the shadows of the scullery. She took her own place at the table, sitting beside Harlan at the head of the board. She sat tall, her broad shoulders squared, her presence monumental. For the first time in 22 years, she didn't feel like a space taker or a burden. She felt like a pillar. Harlan reached beneath the table, his large, calloused hand finding hers and gripping it with a firm, grounding pressure. He didn't need to say a word. The look in his icy blue eyes, a mixture of fierce pride and a burgeoning, soul-deep adoration, was the only contract she needed. As the lanterns began to flicker low and the men finally drifted back toward the bunkhouse, each of them pausing to give her a somber, respectful nod, Evelina stood alone at the kitchen window. The storm was over and the first stars were beginning to pierce the indigo velvet of the sky, glinting off the vast white empire of Ironwood. She looked at Moff, her reflection in the glass. She saw the width of her shoulders, the strength in her jaw, and the sheer, magnificent scale of her form. She didn't see a prize heifer or a girl built like a barn. She saw a foundation stone. She saw a woman who was scaled to match the horizon itself. The fire in the massive black stove settled into a steady cherry-red pulse. Evelina reached out and touched the iron key ring at her waist, the metallic jingle, a song of absolute belonging. She wasn't just the wife of the monster of Ironwood. She was the heart of the fortress, and her resourcefulness had spoken a truth that no insult could ever silence. Her value was as vast as the land she now ruled. Thank you for joining us for this chapter of the Cowboy Heartweaver. Remember, the strongest love isn't always found in words, but in the quiet respect of a heart that truly sees you. Until next time, keep the fire burning. This channel utilizes curated online resources and AI tools to create content for entertainment and educational purposes. Our content is created with respect and does not intend to promote hate or violate any community standards.
Thank you for joining us for this chapter of the Cowboy Heartweaver. Remember, the strongest love isn't always found in words, but in the quiet respect of a heart that truly sees you. Until next time, keep the fire burning. This channel utilizes curated online resources and AI tools to create content for entertainment and educational purposes.